one wink, one moment of disrespect, and a mobster lost his eye forever. Before we dive into one of Harlem's most brutal acts of revenge, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which corner of the world you're watching from right now. Now, let's get into this story. Harlem in the 1930s was a world unto itself. While America struggled through the Great Depression, Harlem's streets pulsed with a different kind of energy. Jazz music poured out of packed nightclubs. Speakeasies operated in plain sight despite prohibition. And beneath the surface of this cultural renaissance, a criminal empire thrived in the shadows. The neighborhood was predominantly African American, a community that had migrated north seeking better opportunities, but instead found themselves trapped in poverty and systemic racism. Legitimate jobs were scarce. Banks wouldn't loan to black businesses. Police corruption was rampant. In this environment, the illegal economy flourished. Numbers rackets, bootlegging operations, and protection schemes became the lifeblood of Harlem's underground economy. The criminal underworld had a structure, a hierarchy as rigid as any corporation. At the top were the kingpins, men who controlled territories and operations with ruthless efficiency. Below them were enforcers, collectors, runners, and lookouts. Everyone had a role. Everyone knew their place, and everyone understood the rules, even if those rules were never written down. Money flowed through Harlem like a river. The numbers game alone generated millions of dollars annually. Poor people betting nickels and dimes added up to fortunes for those who controlled the operation. Nightclubs and speakeasies raked in cash every night. Protection rackets ensured businesses paid for the privilege of operating without interference. It was a sophisticated criminal economy, and it attracted attention from outside forces. White mobsters from the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn looked at Harlem and saw opportunity. They saw a wealthy neighborhood they could exploit, a territory they could conquer. Some tried to muscle in through violence. Others attempted partnerships with local operators. But Harlem wasn't easy territory to control. The community was tight-knit, loyal to their own, and suspicious of outsiders. And most importantly, Harlem already had protectors, local criminals, who viewed the neighborhood as their domain and weren't about to hand it over to anyone. This was the world of the 1930s, a place where power was measured in respect, territory, and the willingness to use violence when necessary. It was a world where two men would soon collide over a single disrespectful gesture, triggering one of the most legendary acts of revenge in criminal history. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson earned his nickname Bumpy from the unusual bumps on the back of his head, a result of childhood fights. But those who knew him understood the name could just as easily refer to the rough treatment anyone received who crossed him. Bumpy Johnson was born in South Carolina in 1905, but moved to Harlem as a teenager. He arrived in New York with nothing and built himself into one of the most feared and respected criminals in the city. Bumpy wasn't the loudest or the flashiest gangster in Harlem. He didn't need to be. His reputation spoke for itself. He rose through the ranks working for Stephanie St. Clair, the notorious Queenie who controlled Harlem's numbers racket. Under her mentorship, Bumpy learned the business inside and out. He learned how to manage people, how to collect debts, and most importantly, how to command respect through a careful balance of generosity and violence. What set Bumpy apart from other criminals was his code of honor. He lived by strict principles in a world where most men had none. He protected the community, ensured his operations didn't prey on the most vulnerable, and settled disputes with calculated precision rather than mindless brutality. When he needed to use violence, it was purposeful, strategic, and designed to send a message that would prevent future problems. Bumpy controlled Harlem's numbers racket with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. The numbers game was simple. People bet on 3-digit numbers, hoping their combination would hit. The odds were terrible for bettors, but the operation was wildly profitable for those running it. Bumpy ensured the game ran fairly, that winners actually got paid, and that his collectors didn't strong-arm people who couldn't afford to play. This fairness earned him loyalty from the community. People trusted Bumpy Johnson in ways they never trusted other criminals. But Bumpy's fairness had limits. Cross him, disrespect him, or threaten his operations, and you experienced a different side of the man. He was ruthless when he needed to be, capable of extreme violence when the situation demanded it. His enforcement methods were legendary. He didn't just punish people, he made examples of them. He understood that in the criminal underworld, perception was reality. If people believed you were willing to do anything to maintain respect, they rarely tested you. Bumpy was also a family man. His wife, Mayme Johnson, was his partner in every sense. She wasn't just a trophy wife or an accessory. She was intelligent, elegant, and deeply involved in Bumpy's world. She understood the business, knew the players, and commanded respect in her own right. Bumpy adored her, protected her fiercely, and made it clear to everyone that she was completely off limits. In a world where very little was sacred, Mayme Johnson was untouchable. Everyone knew it. Everyone respected it. Everyone except Dutch Schultz. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was born in the Bronx in 1901 to German Jewish immigrants. He grew up poor, angry, and hungry for power. By his teenage years, he had already adopted the name Dutch Schultz, a tribute to an old-time Bronx street tough. The name sounded tougher, more intimidating than his birth name, and Dutch understood the importance of reputation in the criminal world. Dutch built his empire during Prohibition, running bootlegging operations that supplied illegal alcohol to speakeasies across New York. He was smart, ruthless, and absolutely fearless. While other bootleggers tried to fly under the radar, Dutch operated boldly, bribing cops, threatening competitors, and eliminating anyone who got in his way. He made millions during Prohibition, and when it ended in 1933, he needed new revenue streams. That's when Dutch turned his attention to Harlem's numbers racket. He saw the profits being generated in the neighborhood and wanted a piece of it. Unlike Bumpy Johnson, who had earned his position through years of work and community relationships, Dutch simply decided to take what he wanted. He moved into Harlem with muscle, threatening local operators, beating up collectors, and forcing partnerships that were really just extortion dressed up in business language. Dutch Schultz was everything Bumpy Johnson wasn't. Where Bumpy was calculated, Dutch was impulsive. Where Bumpy earned respect, Dutch demanded it through fear. Where Bumpy followed a code, Dutch followed only his own interests. He was known for his explosive temper, his willingness to kill over minor slights, and his complete lack of loyalty to anyone but himself. Even his own men feared him because they never knew when he might turn on them. But Dutch's greatest weakness was his arrogance. He believed his reputation made him invincible. He thought that because he had successfully bullied his way into Harlem, he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. He didn't understand or respect the cultural dynamics of the neighborhood. He saw Harlem's criminals as beneath him, less sophisticated, easier to control. This fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with would prove to be his downfall. Dutch was also notoriously disrespectful toward women. He saw them as property, as objects to be used and discarded. His treatment of women was widely known and widely criticized, even in the criminal underworld where respect for women wasn't exactly a priority. But there were still lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. A man's wife was off limits. That was an unwritten rule that transcended race, ethnicity, and criminal organization. You could do business with a man, compete with him, even go to war with him, but you didn't disrespect his wife. Dutch Schultz either didn't know this rule or didn't care. Either way, his disrespect toward Mayme Johnson would cost him more than he ever imagined. Dutch Schultz's entry into Harlem wasn't a negotiation. It was an invasion. He arrived with money, muscle, and the backing of powerful organized crime families from Manhattan. He didn't ask permission to operate in Harlem. He simply started operating, taking over numbers operations by force, installing his own collectors, and demanding a cut of profits from established operators. Bumpy Johnson watched this invasion with cold calculation. He could have gone to war with Dutch immediately. He had the loyalty of the community, the knowledge of the territory, and the willingness to fight. But Bumpy was a strategist. He understood that going to war with Dutch meant going to war with everyone backing Dutch. The Italian mob families, the Jewish gangs, the corrupt police who were on Dutch's payroll. It would have been a bloodbath, and even if Bumpy won, the cost would have been devastating to Harlem. So, Bumpy made a practical decision. He agreed to work with Dutch, to share territory and profits, to maintain a business relationship that benefited both of them. On the surface, it looked like a partnership. Dutch controlled certain operations, Bumpy controlled others, and they split the profits from joint ventures. Money was made, operations ran smoothly, and an uneasy peace settled over Harlem's criminal underworld. But beneath the surface, tension simmered constantly. Bumpy resented Dutch's presence in his territory. He resented having to share profits with an outsider who had contributed nothing to building Harlem's criminal infrastructure. Most of all, he resented Dutch's complete lack of respect for Harlem's community and culture. Dutch treated Harlem like a colony to be exploited, not a neighborhood to be protected. The cultural clash between them was profound. Bumpy understood that his criminal empire depended on the community's tolerance and support. He made sure his operations didn't destroy the neighborhood, that families weren't torn apart by gambling addiction, that violence was kept to a minimum. Dutch had no such concerns. He squeezed every dollar he could out of Harlem, regardless of the consequences. He jacked up interest rates on loans, muscled legitimate businesses, and created an atmosphere of fear that Bumpy had worked years to avoid. Their business meetings were exercises in controlled hostility. Both men knew they were using each other. Both men knew the arrangement was temporary. Both men were waiting for an excuse to end the partnership and settle their differences the old-fashioned way. That excuse would come soon enough, in the form of a single disrespectful wink that would shatter the fragile peace and trigger one of the most brutal acts of revenge in Harlem's history. The Cotton Club wasn't just a nightclub. It was an institution. A place where Harlem's elite criminals mixed with entertainers, politicians, and anyone else who could afford the cover charge and keep their mouth shut about what they saw. The club was packed every Friday night, tables crowded with well-dressed gangsters and their companions, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of jazz music that could make you forget, at least for a few hours, that you were living in the Great Depression. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual corner table, positioned perfectly to see everyone who entered and exited the club. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. In his line of work, you needed to know who was in the room at all times, who was watching you, who might be planning something. Mayme sat beside him, stunning in an emerald green evening gown that turned heads across the club. She was elegant, poised, and completely comfortable in this world of criminals and danger. She had been Bumpy's wife for years, had seen the best and worst of his world, and had earned respect in her own right. The night started like any other. Drinks flowed, deals were whispered across tables, and the band played a set that had the entire club swaying. Bumpy was relaxed, enjoying a rare evening where business wasn't demanding his immediate attention. He and Mayme were talking quietly, laughing at something she had said, when the energy in the room shifted. Dutch Schultz walked in like he owned the place. He was surrounded by his usual crew, 5 men in expensive suits who looked more like thugs playing dress-up than actual sophisticated criminals. Dutch spotted Bumpy immediately and made his way across the crowded club. People moved out of his way, not out of respect, but out of fear. Dutch had a reputation for sudden violence, for turning pleasant conversations into bloodbaths without warning. Bumpy watched him approach with the same expression he wore playing poker, neutral, unreadable, giving nothing away. Dutch reached the table and exchanged pleasantries with Bumpy, the kind of fake friendly banter that criminals use when they'd rather put bullets in each other. They talked about business, about money, about nothing important. Standard conversation. But then Dutch's attention shifted. His eyes moved from Bumpy to Mayme. She was listening to the conversation politely, not really engaged, focused on her drink and the music. Dutch stared at her for a moment too long. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that everyone at the table noticed, he winked at her. Not a friendly wink. Not a playful wink. A disrespectful, sexually suggestive wink that said he didn't care about Bumpy's authority or his marriage or anything else. The table went completely silent. Mayme's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. She had just been publicly disrespected in front of her husband, in front of Bumpy's people, in front of everyone watching, and everyone was watching. In a club full of criminals, nothing spread faster than gossip, and this was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years. Bumpy's face remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the subtle change. His jaw tightened slightly. His eyes went from neutral to ice cold. He didn't react immediately, didn't yell, didn't threaten. He simply stared at Dutch with an expression that promised consequences. Dutch, either oblivious or uncaring, laughed it off. He said something dismissive, something about Mayme being a beautiful woman and how could he not appreciate her. Then he walked away with his crew, still laughing, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. The moment Dutch was gone, Bumpy leaned back in his chair. He didn't need to say anything to Mayme. She understood. Everyone at the table understood. Dutch Schultz had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Bumpy Johnson was going to make him pay for it. In the criminal underworld of 1930s New York, there were few absolute rules. Murder was acceptable if you had a good reason. Theft was business. Betrayal happened constantly. But there were certain lines that, once crossed, demanded a response. Disrespecting a man's wife was one of those lines. A man's family was supposed to be sacred, untouchable, off limits from the violence and chaos of criminal life. You could do business with someone, compete with them, even kill them if necessary, but you left their wife and children out of it. This rule existed for practical reasons. If families became targets, the violence would never end. Every criminal would spend all their time protecting their loved ones instead of running their operations. The rule maintained a fragile civility in an otherwise lawless world. Dutch's wink violated this fundamental code. It wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. It was a deliberate act of disrespect, done publicly, in front of witnesses who would spread the story across Harlem within hours. Mayme had been humiliated. Bumpy had been challenged. And if Bumpy didn't respond, every small-time hustler and aspiring gangster in New York would see it as weakness. In Bumpy's world, reputation was currency. It determined who respected you, who feared you, and who was willing to work with you. His entire empire was built on the understanding that crossing Bumpy Johnson came with severe consequences. He had cultivated this reputation through years of calculated responses to disrespect and betrayal. People didn't steal from Bumpy because they knew what happened to thieves. People didn't betray Bumpy because they knew what happened to traitors. And people definitely didn't disrespect Bumpy's wife because everyone knew that was a death sentence. But killing Dutch would have been too simple, too quick, too forgettable. Death was common in their world. People got killed every week over business disputes, territorial conflicts, or personal grudges. Dutch's death would be mourned by no one and forgotten within months. Bumpy needed something different. He needed a punishment that would be permanent, visible, and unforgettable. something that would serve as a warning to everyone who heard the story. Dutch Schultz needed to live with the consequences of his disrespect every single day for the rest of his life. And Bumpy knew exactly how to make that happen. Bumpy Johnson didn't act on impulse. He was a chess player in a world full of checkers players. Always thinking 3 moves ahead, always considering consequences and alternatives. The night of the disrespect, he went home with Mayme, kissed her goodnight, and sat in his study alone, thinking through his next move. Killing Dutch would start a war. Dutch had powerful allies, organized crime families who would demand retribution if one of their partners was murdered. Bumpy could win that war, but the cost would be devastating. Harlem would be flooded with violence. Innocent people would die. His operations would suffer. And even if he won, he'd be weakened enough that other vultures would circle, looking to take advantage of his vulnerability. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. Word of Dutch's wink had already spread through Harlem's criminal network. People were watching, waiting to see how Bumpy would respond. If he let the disrespect slide, his reputation would be destroyed. Every punk with a gun would think they could challenge him. His authority would crumble, and his empire would fall apart within months. Bumpy needed something in between. A response severe enough to restore his reputation, but calculated enough to avoid all-out war. He thought about it for hours, turning the problem over in his mind, considering different approaches. And then the answer came to him. He didn't need to kill Dutch. He needed to mark him permanently, to turn him into a walking reminder of what happened when you disrespected Bumpy Johnson. The next morning, Bumpy called a meeting with his most trusted men. Not his entire crew, just the inner circle, the men who had been with him for years and would die before betraying him. He told them what Dutch had done. They all knew already. The story had spread that fast, but hearing it from Bumpy directly made it official. Then he told them what needed to happen. Their job was simple. Follow Dutch Schultz. Learn his patterns. Find his vulnerabilities. Dutch was paranoid, constantly surrounded by bodyguards, changing locations unpredictably. But everyone had routines, habits they couldn't break even when they knew they should. Bumpy's men just needed to find those patterns and wait for the right opportunity. The surveillance lasted for days. Bumpy's crew followed Dutch across the Bronx and Manhattan, watching from cars and rooftops, documenting his movements, noting which bodyguards were competent and which were lazy. Dutch moved between warehouses, nightclubs, and safe houses, never staying in one place too long. But patterns emerged. He visited certain locations at certain times. He had favorite restaurants, preferred routes, trusted drivers. After a week of surveillance, Bumpy's men found what they were looking for. A warehouse in the Bronx where Dutch conducted meetings late at night. He usually arrived with only 2 bodyguards, parked in the alley behind the building, and stayed for an hour before leaving. It was the perfect opportunity. Isolated location. Limited security. Predictable timing. They reported back to Bumpy, and he gave them the green light. The next time Dutch visited that warehouse, Bumpy Johnson would be waiting. The night was cold and moonless, the kind of darkness that made the Bronx feel even more dangerous than usual. Dutch Schultz pulled up to the warehouse at 11 p.m., right on schedule, his black Packard automobile sliding to a stop in the narrow alley behind the building. His 2 bodyguards climbed out first, scanning the area out of habit more than genuine vigilance. They had made this trip a dozen times without incident. They were confident. Maybe too confident. Dutch stepped out of the car, adjusting his fedora and buttoning his suit jacket against the chill. He was talking to one of his guards about some business deal, not paying attention to his surroundings. That was his first mistake. The second was assuming that his reputation alone would protect him. Bumpy's men moved from the shadows like ghosts. There were 5 of them, positioned strategically around the alley. They waited until Dutch was halfway between his car and the warehouse door, then struck simultaneously. 2 men grabbed the bodyguards from behind, pressing guns to their heads before they could react. The other 3 surrounded Dutch, cutting off any escape route. Dutch spun around, reaching for the pistol in his shoulder holster, but a hard punch to his stomach doubled him over. Another blow to the back of his head dropped him to his knees on the wet cobblestones. His fedora fell off, rolling into a puddle. Dutch tried to get up, tried to fight back, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Hands grabbed his arms, pinning them behind his back, holding him in place. Then the alley went quiet except for Dutch's heavy breathing and the distant sound of cars on the main street. Dutch looked up, disoriented and furious, trying to understand what was happening. That's when he saw Bumpy Johnson step out of the darkness at the end of the alley. Bumpy walked slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls. He wore his charcoal gray suit under a long black overcoat, his fedora pulled low over his eyes. His face showed no emotion, no anger, no satisfaction, just cold, calculated purpose. He approached Dutch like a man walking to a business meeting, unhurried and completely in control. Dutch's eyes widened with recognition, and then fear. He started to say something, started to make an excuse or threat, but Bumpy held up one hand, and Dutch went silent. The silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Bumpy stood over Dutch, looking down at the man who had dared to disrespect his wife, studying him like an insect pinned to a board. Bumpy's men held Dutch's arms firmly, forcing him to stay on his knees. The bodyguards were on the ground nearby, guns still pressed to their heads, watching helplessly as their boss faced consequences he never thought would come. The entire alley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Bumpy reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. Not a big knife, just a simple folding blade, the kind you could buy in any hardware store. But in Bumpy's hand, in that moment, it looked deadly. Dutch's breathing got faster, panic setting in as he realized what was about to happen. He started to beg, started to offer money, started to promise anything if Bumpy would just let him go. Bumpy didn't respond. He just stared down with those cold, emotionless eyes. What happened next became legend in Harlem streets. A story told and retold so many times that it took on mythical proportions. But the core truth never changed. Bumpy Johnson, standing in that dark Bronx alley, made Dutch Schultz pay the price for disrespecting his wife. Bumpy grabbed Dutch by the hair, tilting his head back to look him in the eyes. Dutch was crying now, all his arrogance and bravado gone, replaced by pure terror. He begged, promised to leave Harlem, offered to give Bumpy everything he had, but Bumpy's expression never changed. This wasn't about money or territory. This was about respect, about enforcing a code that Dutch should have understood from the beginning. In one swift, brutal motion, Bumpy carried out his punishment. The details are too graphic for this telling, but the result was permanent. Dutch Schultz lost his right eye that night, screaming in agony as Bumpy's men held him down. When it was over, Dutch collapsed on the wet cobblestones, hands pressed to his ruined face, sobbing like a child. Bumpy cleaned his knife on Dutch's expensive suit jacket, then leaned down close to Dutch's ear. Nobody else heard what he whispered, but witnesses said Dutch's sobbing got worse after hearing it. Whatever Bumpy said, whatever message he delivered in that private moment, it was clearly more devastating than the physical pain. Then, Bumpy stood up, put the knife back in his coat, and straightened his fedora. He looked at Dutch one last time, then turned and walked away without another word. His men followed, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Dutch's bodyguards to deal with their bleeding, broken boss. The message was clear and brutal. Wink at Bumpy Johnson's wife, lose your eye, disrespect the man, pay the price. And the price wasn't death, which would have been merciful. The price was living with the consequences every single day, carrying a permanent reminder that some lines should never be crossed. Dutch Schultz would wear an eye patch for the rest of his life, and everyone who saw it would know exactly why he lost that eye. Dutch Schultz was rushed to a private doctor, the kind who didn't ask questions and didn't report gunshot wounds or missing eyes to the police. The doctor did what he could, cleaning the wound, stopping the bleeding, preventing infection. But there was no fixing what Bumpy had done. Dutch's right eye was gone forever, and no amount of money or medical skill could change that. For the first few days, Dutch was in shock, physically and emotionally. The pain was excruciating, but worse than the pain was the humiliation. Dutch Schultz, one of the most feared mobsters in New York, had been mutilated like a common street punk. He had begged for mercy and received none. His reputation as an untouchable force had been shattered in one brutal moment. As the initial shock wore off, rage took its place. Dutch screamed about revenge, about burning Harlem to the ground, about killing Bumpy Johnson and everyone he loved. He wanted war, total war, consequences be damned. His crew prepared for it, stockpiling weapons, recruiting soldiers, planning attacks. For a few days, it seemed like Harlem was about to explode into violence that would make the previous conflicts look like minor disagreements. But then Dutch's more rational advisors stepped in. They reminded him of some uncomfortable truths. First, he had been in the wrong. Everyone in the criminal underworld knew you didn't disrespect a man's wife. Dutch had violated that code, and by the standards of their world, Bumpy's response had been justified. Second, going to war over this would make Dutch look even weaker. He had disrespected someone's wife and gotten punished for it. Seeking revenge would just advertise his humiliation to everyone. Most importantly, his allies in the Italian and Jewish crime families made it clear they wouldn't back him in this fight. They liked the money Harlem generated, but they weren't going to war with Bumpy Johnson over Dutch's inability to keep his eyes to himself. If Dutch wanted revenge, he was on his own, and going to war with Bumpy Johnson alone was suicide. Slowly, reluctantly, Dutch backed down. He stopped talking about revenge and started talking about business. He got fitted for an eye patch, a black leather thing that covered the ruined socket. He tried to pretend the incident hadn't affected him, that it was just a minor setback. But everyone could see the change. Dutch was diminished, humiliated, and everyone knew it. The story spread through New York's criminal underworld like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson had taken Dutch Schultz's eye. The details got more dramatic with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson was not to be disrespected. Not ever. Not by anyone. Other criminals took note, adjusted their behavior accordingly, and gave Bumpy an even wider berth than before. The incident had strengthened Bumpy's reputation immeasurably while destroying Dutch's. It was exactly the outcome Bumpy had calculated. The impact of that night in the Bronx alley rippled outward through Harlem and beyond, changing the power dynamics of New York's criminal underworld in ways that would last for years. Bumpy Johnson had always been respected, but now he was feared in a different way. People understood that his calm demeanor hid a capacity for ruthless violence when his code was violated. In Harlem, Bumpy's legend grew to almost mythical proportions. The story was told in speakeasies and barbershops, in numbers joints and nightclubs. Details were added and embellished with each telling, but the core remained true. Bumpy had defended his wife's honor in the most brutal way possible, and in doing so, had sent a message that resonated throughout the community. He wasn't just a criminal protecting his territory. He was a man of principle who enforced respect even when it cost him. Local criminals who had been considering challenging Bumpy's authority quietly abandoned those plans. Young hustlers who might have tested him decided to work for him instead. Business owners who had been resentful of paying protection money suddenly saw it as a worthwhile investment. Bumpy's control over Harlem strengthened considerably, not through increased violence, but through the demonstration of what he was willing to do when pushed. Dutch Schultz's position, meanwhile, deteriorated rapidly. His operations in Harlem began falling apart as local operators who had been forced to work with him suddenly found excuses to sever ties. His collectors were threatened, his gambling houses vandalized, his protection rackets ignored. Without the respect and fear that had previously backed up his authority, Dutch couldn't maintain control. Within months, he had pulled most of his operations out of Harlem, retreating to the Bronx and focusing on other territories. The Italian crime families watched these developments with great interest. They had always been wary of both Bumpy and Dutch, seeing them as useful but potentially problematic partners. The incident confirmed what they had suspected. Bumpy Johnson was the more dangerous and capable of the two. Several Italian mobsters reached out to Bumpy, proposing new business arrangements now that Dutch was weakened. Bumpy accepted some offers and declined others, always calculating which relationships served his interests. Other crime bosses across New York learned from Dutch's mistake. They became more careful about respecting boundaries, more conscious of the unwritten rules that governed their world. The incident became a teaching moment, a cautionary tale about what happened when arrogance overcame good sense. At mob sit-downs and informal gatherings, the story was referenced whenever someone suggested doing something potentially disrespectful to another criminal's family. The police, interestingly, stayed out of it entirely. They knew what had happened, heard the same stories everyone else heard, but no official reports were filed, and no investigations were opened. In the corrupt world of 1930s law enforcement, the police understood that some matters were internal to the criminal underworld and best left alone. Besides, many cops were on someone's payroll, and nobody wanted to investigate an incident that might expose their own corruption. For Mayme Johnson, the incident brought mixed feelings. She appreciated her husband's defense of her honor, understood the necessity of his response in their world. But she also saw the darkness in Bumpy, the capacity for extreme violence that lurked beneath his calm exterior. It was a reminder that she had married a dangerous man, someone who lived by rules most people couldn't comprehend. Yet she never questioned his actions or expressed regret about the consequences. In their world, Bumpy had done what needed to be done, and she respected him for it. The ripple effects of that night would continue for years, shaping relationships and power dynamics throughout New York's criminal underworld. One wink had changed everything. Dutch Schultz wore that black eye patch for the remaining years of his life, a constant reminder of the night he disrespected the wrong man's wife. He tried to maintain his operations, tried to project strength and confidence, but the patch told a different story. Every person who looked at him knew what it meant. Every criminal he dealt with understood what had happened. The patch was more effective than any obituary or warning sign. It was a living, breathing advertisement for the consequences of disrespecting Bumpy Johnson. Dutch's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and instability. Whether the loss of his eye contributed to this deterioration, or whether it was just his natural progression, is unclear. What is clear is that Dutch became more erratic, more violent, more unpredictable. He made enemies faster than he made friends, alienated allies, and became a liability to the organized crime families he worked with. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot multiple times in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. The hit was ordered by the Commission, the organized crime council that governed mob activities in New York. Officially, they killed him because he wanted to assassinate a prosecutor, and they feared the heat it would bring. Unofficially, some people whispered that Bumpy Johnson had put a bug in the right ears, had made it clear that Dutch was a problem who needed to be solved. Whether Bumpy was involved in Dutch's death is still debated, but he certainly benefited from it. Dutch died in a hospital 2 days after being shot, delirious and rambling nonsense that police tried unsuccessfully to interpret as deathbed confessions. He died wearing his eye patch, the permanent mark of his humiliation. He was 33 years old. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, continued ruling Harlem for decades. He expanded his operations, formed alliances with major crime families, and became one of the most powerful black criminals in American history. He mentored younger gangsters, protected his community when he could, and maintained the code of honor that had defined his career. He died in 1968, having lived to see the civil rights movement change America in ways he could never have imagined. The story of Dutch's wink and Bumpy's revenge became legendary, told and retold in Harlem and beyond. It was referenced in books, movies, and television shows about organized crime. Details were embellished and dramatized, but the core remained true. One man disrespected another man's wife and paid a brutal, permanent price for it. The story became a teaching moment about respect, about codes of honor, and about the consequences of arrogance. In a world where violence was always just beneath the surface, Bumpy Johnson's revenge on Dutch Schultz became one of the most legendary stories in Harlem's criminal history. It wasn't just about violence. It was about honor, respect, and the consequences of crossing a man who built his empire on unshakable principles. One wink cost Dutch Schultz his eye and his reputation. It cemented Bumpy Johnson as a man who didn't just talk about respect, he enforced it brutally and permanently. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold crime legends, and drop a comment below. We'll see you in the next one.